Hello students, I welcome you all in today's lecture on democracy, its meaning and types. Objectives of our lecture are to understand the basic nature and concept of democracy, to elaborate the evolution of democracy, and to list out its major features and types. Dear students, democracy is a form of government, an ideal, an inspiration and a standard. Long back, former President of United States of America, Abraham Lincoln said, and I quote, "Democracy is a form of government of the people, for the people and by the people." The term democracy is derived from two Greek words, demos, that means people, and kratos, which refers to power, which means rule of the people. Thus, in a democracy, the power rests with the people. This meeting is based on the experiences of the governments that existed in some of the Greek city-states, notably Athens. And today also, democracy is defined as a form of government in which the supreme power is vested in the people and exercised by them directly or indirectly through a system of representation usually involving periodic elections. When you examine the definition of democracy as suggested above, you will find that most of those definitions define democracy as a form of government which is run by the elected representatives. The core element of democracy is self-rule. In literal sense, it rejects the separation of the two, that is, between the ruler and the ruled. It is interesting to note that unlike the terms communism and socialism, which have a point of reference in Marxism, democracy has not been associated with a specific doctrinal source or ideology. In fact, it is a byproduct of the entire development of Western civilization and therefore tends to be used rather loosely. Thus, democracy is a form of government in which the people have the authority to deliberate upon political issues and decide legal framework for a given unit of geography having sovereignty. In a democracy, people elect their representatives to govern them, or in other words, the citizens govern themselves. Although it is believed that the ancient Greece was the origin of this form of government, however, the notion of democracy basically stemmed after the Treaty of Westphalia of 1648. Democracy became socially more favorable after the French Revolution in 1789, and thinkers like Rousseau also advocated and wrote about democracy as a justifiable form of government. On the other hand, monarchy and the supremacy of the church were challenged and attracted widespread criticism. Since then, these ruthless forms of government were started relocating with a democratic form of government in many countries of Europe and the West. Despite such sparking entry in the world's government system, the concept of democracy in Europe, especially after 1648, did not prevent the penetration of the nationalism, thereby leading to the distortion of the genuine concept of democracy. Therefore, until the mid-20th century, democracy did not have smooth sailing, partly because the democracy had to compete with the challenges of Nazism, fascism and totalitarianism till the end of the Second World War. Eventually, after 1945, the norms of democracy became more famous and spread across the world. In this form of government, the supreme power are vested in people. Moreover, in a large societies, democracy can be exercised by the people of that society or state directly or indirectly. It can be exercised through the elected representatives of the citizens. Democracy is more than just a set of same government institutions. It depends on some well understood set of norms, values, mindset and practices. The cornerstone of democracy include: first, freedom of assembly and association; second, freedom of rights; third, freedom of religion and speech; Fourth, inclusiveness and equality. Fifth, citizenship. Sixth, consent of the government. Seventh, voting rights. Eighth, freedom from unwarranted governmental deprivations of the rights to life and liberty. And ninth, minority rights. In a lecture titled, and I quote, "What is democracy?" Larry Diamond gave an overview of what, in his opinion, is democracy. He describes democracy as a system of government with four key elements, which are a system for choosing and replacing the government through free and fair elections. Second, active participation of the people as citizens in politics and civic life. Third, protection of the human rights of all citizens. And the fourth, rule of law in which the laws and procedures apply equally to all citizens. Dear students, the democracy has been defined by various scholars in a very different way, like according to Albert Camus, I quote, "Democracy is not the law of the majority, but the protection of the minority," unquote. And Martha Nussbaum regards democracy the capacity of all voters to participate freely and fully in the life of their society. Similarly, Larry Diamond regards democracy a form of government in which all citizens have equal say in the lawmaking. The Webster New Encyclopedia Dictionary defines democracy as, and I quote, "a government in which supreme power is invested in the people and exercised by them directly or indirectly through representation," unquote. Dear students, let's discuss the evolution and development of democracy. The ancient Greeks are credited with creating the very first democracy, although there were almost certainly earlier examples of primitive democracy in other parts of the world. The Greek model was established in the 5th century BC in the city of Athens. Among a sea of autocracies and oligarchies, which were the normal forms of government at the time, Athenian democracy stood out. However, compared to how we understand democracy today, the Athenian model had two important differences. First, theirs was a form of direct democracy. In other words, instead of electing representatives to govern on the people's behalf, the people themselves met, discussed questions of government, and then implemented policy. And second, such a system was possible partly because the people was a very limited category. Those who could participate directly were a small part of the population, since women, slaves, aliens, and of course children were excluded. The numbers who participated were still far more than in a modern democracy. Perhaps 50,000 males engaged directly in politics out of a population of around 3 million people. Democracy in contemporary world. Today, there are as many different forms of democracy as there are democratic nations in the world. No two systems are exactly the same, and no one system can be taken as a model. There are presidential and parliamentary democracies, democracies that are federal or unitary, democracies that use a proportional voting system, and ones that use a majoritarian system, democracies which are also monarchies, and so on. One thing that unites modern systems of democracy and which also distinguishes them from the ancient model is the use of representatives of the people. Instead of taking part directly in lawmaking, modern democracies use elections to select representatives who are sent by the people to govern on their behalf. Such a system is known as representative democracy. It can lay some claim to being democratic because it is at least to some degree based on two principles: equality of all and the right of every individual to some degree of personal autonomy. Dear students, let's discuss some basic types of democracy. There are mainly two forms of democracy: direct and indirect, or representative democracy. But with time, various types of democracy emerged like participatory, deliberative, cosmopolitan democracy, and etc. are also being discussed. Direct democracy. Direct democracy is a political system where the citizens participate in the decision-making process personally, contrary to relying on intermediaries or representatives. At its most basic level, direct democracy means involving the public directly in making decisions. By contrast, representative democracy involves public choosing representatives who take these decisions on their behalf. A direct democracy gives the voting population the power to first, change the constitutional laws, second, put forth initiatives, referendums and suggestions for laws, third, to give binding orders to elective officials such as revoking them before the end of their elected term or initiating a lawsuit for breaking a campaign promise. According to ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle, the important aspect of direct democracy is the mechanism that all command each and each in his turn all. It was accomplished in a classical Athens through a system of administration that was established as a result of a large gathering. The referendum is its contemporary expression. In rural India, the Gram Sabha, as it is described in the 73rd Constitutional Amendment, is an example of direct democracy. Switzerland currently has a direct democracy system of government. The democratic concepts and practices have existed for a very long period in a variety of ways. As far back as historical studies go, the communities have attempted to rule themselves in various parts of the world with the permission or consent of their citizens. This tendency is occasionally referred to as early democracy. Ancient notions of democracy have frequently been linked to the Greeks, who in some places engaged in a more direct style of government than we do now. Large swaths of the population of ancient Athens, for instance, participated in deliberation and group decision making. Liberal intellectuals of the 18th and 19th century, on the other hand, were dubious of this form of direct authority because they saw it as unstable and prone to oppressing minorities. They supported representative democracy, saying that the elected officials had the necessary skills to judge what was in public interest. One of the framers of the US Constitution, James Madison, and other thinkers shared the belief that concentrating power in the hands of a smaller, more knowledgeable number of people would reduce the likelihood of politics being dominated by self-interest. One of the most well-known advocates of representative democracy is the political philosopher Edmund Burke. His view that elected representatives should not be bound to obey the particular wishes of their electors but should form their own judgment remain relevant today. Dear students, let's discuss some merits of direct democracy. The merits of direct democracy include the following. First, it heightens the control that citizens can exercise over their own destinies as it is the only pure form of democracy. Second, it creates a better informed and more politically sophisticated citizenry, and thus it has educational benefits. Third, it enables the public to express their own views and interests without having to rely on self-serving politicians. Fourth, it ensures that rule is legitimate in the sense that people are more likely to accept decisions that they have made themselves. Representative democracy and its critiques. Since direct democracy is impractical in large, complex cultures, individuals participate in government indirectly by choosing representatives to carry out their wishes. Representative government, according to early social contract theorists like Hobbes and Locke, was a kind of government chosen by the people to represent them. However, Rousseau believed that because representatives' views and interests could never coincide with the electorate's, the sovereign power of the state should instead reside with the people and their general will. Regardless, representative government, which is founded on the majority rule, is now seen as the most effective means to implement democracy. Elections of government representatives is a component of representative or indirect democracy. A democratic republic is one in which the president is also democratically elected. The processes that are used most frequently entail electing the candidate with a majority or plurality of the votes. The majority of the Western nations use representational government. A feature of representative democracy is that despite being chosen by the people to represent their interests, the representatives are nonetheless allowed to use their own discretion in how to carry out their duties. It has, however, two types of critics: those who consider it unrealistic and those who consider it inadequate. The Schumpeter view of democracy projects this statement of the classical 18th century theory of democracy as an inaccurate account of what democracy is really about. According to Joseph Schumpeter, the traditional idea of democracy makes the incorrect assumption that sovereignty rests with the people who choose representatives to a body where their wishes can be carried out. Democracy is envisioned as an institutional framework for making political decisions that in this way realize the common good. The Schumpeter contends that democracy is not actually about popular sovereignty. It is not true that democracy's principal function is to give a sovereign people political power, with the election of leaders serving as its secondary function. Instead, it appears that democracy's primary goal is to choose leaders from among a predetermined group of candidates who are vying for public support. The people merely lend their support to one or the other leader. Leadership is the driving force. This democratic ideology is referred to as realist. The participatory democracy. The classical theory of participatory democracy is found in the writings of Rousseau and John Stuart Mill. The foundations of Rousseau's ideology is the involvement of each and every person in political decision making. The connection between the citizens is one of the interdependence, where each person is equally dependent on each other and of all of them are considered as being sovereign as a whole. Participation is crucial for successful governance and for safeguarding private interests in addition to decision making. Like Rousseau, Mill believes that civic participation may educate its participants. Mill's ideal polity is a popular democratic one, where participation institutions encourage engaged individuals and a public spirit personality. The person is forced to consider the public interest and make judgments that are motivated by the idea of common good rather than by his own selfish interests through the use of this mechanism. The democratic institutions are thus a school of political capacity, especially municipal ones. The direct participatory democracy is unachievable in vast, complicated civilizations. However, modern democratic theorists like Carol Pathman and Benjamin Barber have argued in favor of participatory or strong democracy, where the average citizen is more completely involved in decision-making processes than is feasible within the confines of representative democracy. This could take the form of enhancing local democracy to encourage participation of residents in social movements and local issues. In general, proponents of participatory democracy agree with Mill that civic education is important for fostering more politically engaged and active citizens. They prioritize the idea that political engagement is essential to fulfill existence for all people and that it can help prevent government officials from abusing their positions of authority. The deliberative democracy. Deliberative democracy is a form of democracy that values open and public deliberation on issues of common concern. The idea that social democracy is more than democracy and less than socialism has really been put forth. According to social democrats, everyone should receive an equal share of resources of society so that they can fulfill their own personal goals as they age. It is the responsibility of the state to eliminate obstacles if they exist due to poverty, a disability, or membership in a minority. The well-being of the workers, women, the elderly, people with disabilities, members of cultural minorities, and others is a priority for social democracy. Fundamentally, it is motivated by a desire to foster equality, allowing all citizens to equally use their democratic rights. The deliberative democracy allows for a political division of labor between citizen and professional politicians, though voters are active in debate about public issues. This is in contrast to participatory democracy, which necessitates individuals' ongoing participation in decision making. Social democracy. A democratic system known as social democracy is strongly committed to equality. Therefore, social democrats are in favor of the notion of welfare state based on redistribution. They support representative democracies, liberal institutions, and want to integrate them with the concept of social justice. Social democracy is more equitable than liberalism, to the extent that liberalism typically takes the shape of right-wing libertarianism, which is a belief in the unrestricted freedom of person and the free market. It can be said to stand at the nexus of these two ideas, but it is less extreme than Marxist socialism. The idea that social democracy is more than democracy and less than socialism has really been put forth. Cosmopolitan democracy. Political theorists have advocated cosmopolitan democracy in the context of globalization. It is thought that democracy must adapt to these problems beyond the confines of the nation-state with the emergence of forms of supranational organizations such as the European Union and the advancement of economic and cultural globalization. To address this issue, the concept of cosmopolitan democracy was developed. The national state has not been supplanted by a single institution of global governance. According to this thesis, globalization from below is what gave rise to global civil society. The idea of cosmopolitan citizenship is a result of the new international bonds that are being formed. The environmental movement and the women's movement are two notable examples of this. The effects of the communications and the internet revolutions on the democracy are unclear as the world becomes more quickly connected and interconnected. Are folks able to participate in them in reality? For instance, the World Trade Organization continues to be receptive to the more developed countries and their interests, even though the majority of its members are developing countries, who represent the bulk of the world's population. Dear students, this was all about today's lecture on democracy, meaning and types. I hope you enjoyed the lecture. Thank you all.